It's really nice to see everyone who's present here. I haven't seen all of you in some time, so it's especially a privilege to see you. And for those who are watching online, as I frequently do, myself, we welcome you just as warmly to this service. I want to say a special thanks to Chris and to the elders for the opportunity to speak. I consider this a sacred privilege. And I would thoroughly enjoy listening to Dale this morning, so I'm also grateful that he has passed and given me a chance to speak to you. I really enjoy a good sports movie. One of my favorite baseball movies is entitled For Love of the Game, starring Kevin Costner and Kelly Preston. It's a story of a 40-year-old pitcher on the Detroit Tigers. And at this point in my life, I cheer for the old guys, who is pitching a game in Yankee Stadium. And as he's pitching this game, he's thinking about his life and going back through his career, and he pitches a perfect game. But one of the things he thinks about is his relationship to his girlfriend, played by Kelly Preston, whose name is Jane Aubrey in the movie. Last July, I was very saddened to learn that Kelly Preston died from cancer at the age of 57. And when she died, there was a bit of a controversy about her death because some of her fans thought that she had refused medical treatment as a result of the church that she and her husband, John Travolta, belonged to. However, Travolta, in his statement about her death, made a special point of thanking the staff of MD Anderson Hospital in Houston for the medical care that they had provided to his wife in her final days, apparently breaking with the policies of that church. The church is a strange kind of amalgam of different beliefs. It started out as a type of a therapy, a psychotherapy called Dianetics. And then they were taken to court by the government for practicing medicine without a license and decided they would become a religion. And so they converted from psychotherapy to religion, added a little philosophy, and voila, you have this church. Well, I've told you this story because I think that that particular configuration of psychology, philosophy, with a little bit of religion thrown in, is a pretty good analogy of what's happening in ancient Colossae. The Colossians were facing a threat from a group of people who were convinced that they should be practicing things that Paul and Paul's disciples didn't think they needed to practice. Our text this morning constitutes the fullest description of this heresy. Now, I just have to tell you one little footnote, if you'll forgive me. I am a scholar, after all, that's how I make my living. For 200 years, people have been trying to figure out what this movement was and trying to identify it with different groups from the ancient world. And in the 90s, I gave a paper in Paris trying to do that. I read a book that detailed 44 different attempts in the 19th and 20th centuries. And given the publication date of that book, when I read that, I thought, well, mine's probably about 52 by now. The truth of the matter is, no one knows what this was about. We just know what the text tells us. And I'm not going to inflict on you another attempt to figure this out. We're just going to take the text and try to deal with this text as it would relate to us in the 21st century. The author's serious enough about this that the author gave 4 warnings against this particular movement. And our text contains the 3rd and the 4th. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. The 3rd warning is not to allow anyone to condemn us for our diet or our calendar. Well, that strikes me, and it probably strikes you as being a little strange. Why would someone condemn me for what I eat or my calendar? The only reason we worry about diet is when we need to shed a few of these pounds, or if we have a medical condition, we might worry about our diet. There are some who have concerns for the environment or ethical concerns and are vegetarians or vegans as a result of those concerns. But it'd be very unusual, if not completely unheard of, to meet someone today who thought that they had to placate some kind of supernatural beings by adopting a particular diet or religious calendar. But that's apparently what the Colossians thought. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In two earlier letters, Paul addressed the problem of diet and calendars. This was a major issue. So if you lived in an ancient city and you wanted to eat meat, you probably only, unless you were wealthy, only ate meat in some kind of public festival. And that might be something that would take place in a temple of some sort. That's where they had their banquet rooms, was in these temple complexes. And so could Christians participate in such activities? Some said yes, some said no. And Paul said to the Corinthians and to the Romans, remember that what you do has an impact on other people, and think about the implications of what you do on others. But he said, it doesn't really matter what you eat or drink or what your holidays are. One day's as good as another. That's all true. But here there's a prohibition or there's a warning. Don't let someone judge you on the basis of what you eat or drink. Now, as Americans, that would seem to be completely foreign to our culture. I mean, we're not exactly ascetics in this country. But there are people, and I don't know if you've ever heard some of these things, but I'll just tell you some of the things that people have said to me in my life. Well, we don't have a TV. Do you? At the time, I didn't actually, but it didn't really matter. Or, I don't drink. Do you? Or, I don't eat anything that has a mother. Do you? When someone tells me that, my first impulse is to quote Matthew 11. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he's a glutton and a drunkard. I prefer to follow Jesus rather than John the Baptist, but if you want to follow John the Baptist, that's okay. You follow John the Baptist. But I'm going to follow Jesus in my life. In other words, someone doesn't have the right to sit in judgment on another person on the basis of what they eat and drink. Now, does that mean that all asceticism is worthless? No, that's not the point. It's only if you think you have to do this in order to placate some spiritual being. There were lots of early Christians who practiced asceticism. The most spectacular of these were called the Pillar Saints. And there was one fellow by the name of Simeon Stylites. I always thought he should have been a Motown star in the 60s with a name like that. Simeon the Pillar Guy. But anyway, Simeon Stylites lived near Aleppo, Syria, and lived in a platform on top of a couple of different columns for 37 years. Can you imagine that? He had, I presume he had this little base built around it so when he went to sleep, if he had a nightmare, he wouldn't fall off the top of that column because it got to be pretty high. And the legend is that boys used to bring him food on a ladder, and you can see a little ladder there. Well, there's a Catholic nun by the name of Phyllis McGinley who wrote a poem about Simeon that really makes the point that I would like to make. This will remind you a little bit of Dr. Seuss, and she's doing that deliberately. On top of a pillar, Simeon sat. He wore no mantle, he had no hat, but bare as a bird sat night and day, and hardly a word did Simeon say. Under the sun of a desert sky, he sat on a pillar 9 feet high. When Fool and his brother came round to admire, he raised it another 9 feet higher. The seas encircled about his head. He lived on water and crusts of bread, or so one hears, from pilgrim's store for 30 years and a little more. And why did Simeon sit like that, without a garment, without a hat, in a holy rage for the world to see? It puzzles the age. It puzzles me. It puzzled many a desert father, and I think it puzzled the good Lord rather. Asceticism can be fine, and it has its place, and there are people who have good ethical principles for what they do, but you cannot impose it on someone. The fourth warning moves in a different direction. It warns against the pride of those who claim that they have exceptional religious experiences. In this case, those who practice this rigorous asceticism claim that they've had unique visions of God. And this text is not easy to translate, and if you look at different translations, you're liable to read different things. But I think what they're saying is they're claiming that they can ascend and join the angels in worshiping God. That's what the people at Qumran, the Essenes, claimed that they could do. And so they're claiming that they can do this and looking down on the rest of these Colossians saying, well, you don't have the kinds of visions and experience of God that we do. A number of years ago, quite a few years ago, I invited a baker whose shop I used to frequent to come to church. And he looked at me and said, well, is it a spirit-filled church? And I said, absolutely. We wouldn't be Christians if we weren't spirit-filled. And he looked at me pretty quizzically, and I said, well, if you're asking me, do we speak in tongues? No. But if you want to know if the Spirit is present and rules our lives, the answer is unambiguously yes. There are a lot of people who want to claim some kind of particular experience and then look down on others who don't have that experience. This text is saying, no. Now, why? What is it about our experience that should give us confidence that we should never let somebody else look down on us? Well, the Colossians, like many people in the ancient world, thought there were all kinds of beings that lived between earth and heaven. And some of these had evil intentions. It was as if, this is not the exact parallel, but as if they were reading their horoscopes and they were taking all of the zodiac signs and personalizing them as some kind of beings and thinking they had to somehow live their lives in a way that would placate them to avoid bad karma. That's roughly what's going on here. And the author says, no. He says, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the universe, why do you live as if you still belong to the world? The appeal is to our experience in baptism. It was introduced in the second chapter, and now it's going to be explained in chapter 2 and then some more in chapter 3, I presume in the sermon Chris will preach next week here. But if with Christ you died, that is, you were buried with him in baptism, and then you can see, sorry about that. If you've been raised with Christ, what does it mean to die with Christ? It means that God's power that worked in the death of Jesus works in our lives, in our baptism and beyond, so that all evil powers are void. They have no control, no dominion over us in our lives. That's the point. Why are you worrying about these evil powers, the author is saying, when God laid all of those to waste in the death of Christ, and you have that experience. About a year ago, we were in our home in Cheshire, and I was sitting in my office studying. Adrienne was on the second floor in her office working, and I noticed the wind really picked up. And some of you will remember this day, and you probably had a similar experience to what we had. All of a sudden, I heard Adrienne shriek, and I went outside my office, and she said, a big tree, the top of a big tree has just come down in the backyard. And I said, let's go to the basement. So we went down into the basement, and about an hour and a half later, we came up, and the backyard looked like a war zone, or something had gone through there. There were trees that were down. There were tops of trees that had come off. There were branches everywhere. We went to the front yard. There was a huge oak tree in our front yard that had fallen across and was blocking most of the street, which gave me alarm because you don't want to block the street if somebody needs some kind of emergency care. The forces of nature are powerful. In the ancient world, people would personify those and say, well, those are beings, and you have to worry about them. We don't generally personify the forces of nature today, but we realize nature can be rather capricious. One force that all face is death. We will all confront it. We will all go through it. One of my colleagues at the Divinity School lost his wife this last night. This is just something that happens in life, and we know that. How do we have control, or how do we have freedom from fear of all of the forces that can work against us? The author's answer is you have them by your experience of God in Christ Jesus. When you were baptized, and the power of God worked in your life. Many years ago, I was serving a church in Carmichael, California. And I got a call from a friend who was a minister in San Jose. His name was Bill, saying, I just met with a young man named Robert who lives in Carmichael but came to San Jose ostensibly to commit suicide. But he decided before he did this, he would make one last appeal. So he went to the phone book. This is long enough ago, we did have phone books back then. And found a Church of Christ near the head of the churches and called. So Bill said, I'm sending him home to you. I hope you can help him. So I called Robert and set up a time to talk. Now, I'm going to be honest. Robert had not been able to keep a job. He'd not been able to keep any kind of a personal relationship. His life was a wreck, which is why he thought about committing suicide. And I wondered in my heart, can we really help him? So we set up a team. We had 2 counselors in our church, and we had the head of a social service department who got a psychiatrist to help him. And the 2 counselors and the psychiatrist went to work, and I met with him to talk about faith. And over a period of time, Robert became quite interested and said, well, I'd like to be baptized. And we baptized him. And I watched his whole life turn around. He got a job with the post office and kept it. He met a young woman, fell in love, and married her, and began a family. And I've sometimes thought, you didn't have enough faith. That was your problem, speaking to me. But I will never forget how the power of God worked in his life to turn his life around. And I've seen that power at work in other people's lives. That is our experience. it is also our experience that one day we will be raised from the dead. That's the power of God. So why would you worry about somebody telling you some story about a vision or something else? We've lived through one of the most trying periods in all of our lives. We've all lost family members or dear friends. We've all had family members or dear friends lose their jobs, some permanently, some temporarily. We've all lived in enough isolation that it would serve us for the rest of our lives. And if you're like me, I still am a little antsy when I come to a group and I'm thinking, I need my mask. It's been tough for the last year. What do we need? We need relationships, and we need to know that our relationship with God is solid. And that's what this text is telling us we have. Let me try to pull this together with one of the images in the text. In verse 18, the author drew on a famous image from Plato, the Republic, about people who lived in a subterranean cave and had their heads fixed so they could only see the interior wall of the cave. And there were people walking by with a fire behind them. And all these people could see who were in this cave were the shadows on the wall. They couldn't see any real people, just shadows. And Plato's point was, that's not real. The real people are different. Well, maybe I'll give you a different image. There's a famous metaphor from sports called, that's the baptistry. I forgot to show you that. That's in the Duomo in Milan where Ambrose immersed Augustine, if you want to know. But we talk about shadow boxing. And shadow boxing is where you don't actually throw a punch at an opponent. You just throw punches in the air at a fictitious opponent to try to warm up your muscles. But the point is that you can have religion, which is built out of shadows, or you can have the real thing. And the real thing is in Christ, and we experienced it in our baptism and experience it in our lives today and will in the future. That is the message of this text.